we interviewed Victor Gao, the vice president of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization and the former translator for Deng Xiaoping last year. And he talked about how the biggest challenge that we are facing is not between the US and China, but actually AI against mankind as a whole. This is a sentiment that is repeated so often. I hear it all the time through all sides and all sectors of the geopolitical spectrum. But what's interesting about his comment, I think, since last year is that it's become more and more clearly at the forefront of the US-led hybrid war escalations against China. So we have the semiconductor sanctions, we have military companies like Lockheed Martin, etc., heavily investing in AI, as well as surveillance intelligence companies like Palantir, Oracle. And also we have things that most people associate with AI, which is OpenAI and DeepSeek, etc. So it is a very important topic, and that's why we're doing a deep dive today. Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and then the full episode for free on Patreon. So please become a Patreon member. If you want to support our work, we're just trying to diversify our platforms just in case anything happens to our YouTube channel. And just note that if you do make a donation, it will only go to covering our costs. We also have this full episode in audio podcast format every Saturday, Spotify, Amazon Music, and on Patreon with the transcript. This week, we are doing a very special episode all about AI, and we have as our guest Dr. Yann Ryan, a lecturer at the Leiden University Centre for Digital Humanities and the Centre for the Arts in Society in the Netherlands. Sorry, it's a very, very long title, yeah. But welcome, Yann.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me. Look, excited to talk to you.
Yeah, I mean, we've got so much to get into because AI is such a huge subject. And also, I think, as we can see, because it's such a huge topic that most people don't really know anything about AI. So thank you, Yann, again, for coming. Okay, so I mentioned Victor Gao. Let's start from a geopolitical perspective, and then we can go into a little bit more about what AI is, because since this is a geopolitical podcast, I did mention Victor Gao because his perspective very much mirrors, I think, China's approach, because they call it the new frontier in human development, which is really different from the way the US, I mean, yes, the US also thinks of it as a new frontier of human development, but maybe not the development part. They have a very different approach to AI in general. And we can see this from their respective AI action plans. On China's end, we have the Global AI Governance Action Plan, and it proposes 13 actions that should be taken together. Everyone in the world, their proposal is that everybody in the world would take these 13 actions together, because only through global solidarity can we fully, and I'm quoting here, can we fully unleash the potential of AI while ensuring its safety, reliability, controllability, and fairness, and ultimately deliver on the commitments outlined in the UN Pact for the Future and its annex, the Global Digital Compact. Create an inclusive, open, sustainable, fair, safe, and secure digital and intelligent future for all. It's only 13 points, but it has very lofty ambitions. And then meanwhile, on the US action plan side, we have three main pillars that is meant to serve as a roadmap to win the race of global dominance in AI. So that's the contrast between those two countries. But can you help break us down and sort of discuss what this is, what your takeaway is?
As you said, these are two very contrasting documents in lots of ways. So the American one is long and detailed. I'm not sure I would call it specific because it's not exactly clear what they want to do in lots of cases, but it is long and detailed for sure, and very focused on this kind of antagonistic kind of view of AI, I suppose, like sort of combative view of AI, and dividing it into the winners and losers. And the Chinese document, in more than one way, is very contrasted to this, right? So it's quite hand wavy, right? So it's short, as you said, it has lofty sort of noble ideals. The difference in terms of like the ideology, I guess, is that it's very much wanting to do things within this kind of global way, like rather than the American document, which is very deliberately sort of focused on a nationalistic approach. I guess that probably mirrors a lot of the kind of geopolitical thinking and diplomatic thinking between the two countries as well. And yeah, I think that in both cases, they are trying to put forward some kind of vision for how AI is going to be used in the future. One of the things which strikes me about the American document is that I think it's very much has bought into this hype around AI, which is being put forward by powerful figures in Silicon Valley. So there's very much a motivation for AI to be seen as this thing which is going to solve lots of different problems. And in the American document, you kind of see a lot of this same language mirrored. So the kind of things that they talk about what AI is going to do, how it's going to create lots of new jobs, and it's going to need lots of highly skilled workers, or it's going to change the way that we do transport and defense and all of these things. And I think that's really kind of mirroring this sort of hype, this way that the Silicon Valley talks about AI. So it's all about the kind of these sort of imagined things that AI might be able to do in the future, and how America can kind of harness these things. And then on the other side, I think the Chinese global, do they call it an action plan as well?
Yeah, they do. They call it a global AI governance action.
Governance action plan, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, as I said, it's very light on specifics, but I think there is more of a understanding that some of these things may work out. Some of the things related to AI may work out, even though it's quite hand wavy and doesn't have specifics. I think is pointing towards a more practical, more sort of use-based understanding and use of AI in the future. I think more importantly than all that, it's very clearly trying to put forward this view that the global community are the stakeholders rather than one particular country. So yeah, it's wanting to use the UN as a mechanism to do these things and to put these things forward through, and wanting to include the global south as important stakeholders and so forth. So I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah, you really see this very very different ideological approach, but also kind of stylistic approach. Maybe like this, the American document is filled with all these imagined but great things that AI might be used for in the future, and the Chinese one is a little bit more practical, maybe, and thinking about how it's going to work in the short and medium term, and so forth.
Yeah, I think it is really like very much reflective of their approaches. I mean, Trump's admin especially, well, just generally American admin is super pizzazz. Like there's so much pizzazz in the American AI plan. Like
Mm-hmm.
literally the China one is just one page. And
Yeah.
then the US one is like a whole special website with a lot of pictures, but not much substance. I mean, for a roadmap, it doesn't really have a roadmap. It doesn't.
No, and I think it's really focused on these things which are not, either happening or proven, and so thinking about this imaginary future rather than the very real things which AI is being used for or is useful for in the present. Because if they are specific about those, then they need to they're much more accountable, right? If they're talking about actual real today uses today rather than imaginary things in the future, there's no accountability in the second case. So that's kind of interesting.
It's like a film deck. I don't know if you've ever seen like a pitch deck. It's like a film pitch deck. When you want funding, you put together this really amazing pitch deck for funders. And that's what the US one really looks like. And I think that kind of makes sense because they are
Yeah,
funding for this project, this AI project, which we'll get into a little bit more. But I was also trying to look on the Chinese Global Governance Action Plan because
mm.
I remember something about the environment, right? There was one that, and I can't remember now which one.
There is a mention of climate change. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, interestingly, actually, it's not in terms of the in terms of the possible dangers,
Oh.
but rather if you look at point seven.
Oh, and there's also point four, which I think that's interesting. Oh, so there's like two. I guess there's like
Yeah,
point four where they say accelerating digital infrastructure construction,
yeah,
but they also talk about speeding up the construction of global clean power.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I guess that's another kind of interesting difference between these two approaches, right? Yeah, so the I guess that China, in terms of like infrastructure and green power and so forth, is much further ahead of the US and much more focused on that and much more willing to kind of put the weight of the state behind producing green power and so forth. Whereas there is, as far as I can see, no mention at all of the environment in the US document.
Yeah, so it's interesting that on this document we have two. We have four, and we also have seven, which you just mentioned, which is effectively addressing energy and environmental issues.
Yeah,
That is one of the things is perhaps most scary about what AI is doing to our planet right now, right? Can you sort of expand on that?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think these processes for training these AI models are incredibly power hungry. And in the kind of the current like dominant sort of paradigm of how you make these things better and so forth, you have to throw more and more power at these things and more resources. And at the moment, I think it's in a very real way already having catastrophic effects on the environment in terms of greenhouse gases, but also water usage. In a practical way, it's impacting energy grids for countries which are not able to keep up with demand. So Ireland, yes, where I'm from, is a good example. Right, I think there was recently a study saying that about 20% of Ireland's power is now being used to fuel these data centers. And Ireland is not a leader in energy, in green energy, or that has very little natural resources to produce energy itself, doesn't have any nuclear power and so forth. So this is not a country which can afford to give away lots of energy or water and so forth to these resources. So it's a little bit frightening to see that in this entire US document there, as far as I can tell, is not any mention of the impact on the environment or even ways in which green technology or green power could be used. And in fact, in a more general sense, what I would say about this document is it seems to be more interested in just promoting like the key kind of ideological talking points of the administration in the first place, right? So about using up more fossil fuels because that's a good thing, like drilling and so forth. And then also something which maybe we'll talk about after this is about the many mentions of deregulation, something which is much more ideological driven than any sort of reality in the important issues around AI. So I don't think that deregulation is, one of the really key things which need to be tackled if countries want to, have an economy based around AI. I don't think deregulation is so important, but then you see it many, many times throughout this document because that's just one of their key talking points. And so I guess it can be a bit of a Trojan horse to deregulate even further and to use AI as the excuse for that.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about that because, well, there's two quick ways that I can just think of right now. And I actually want you to clarify what other ways deregulation, what they're talking about when they talk about deregulation. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, deregulation in terms of environmental impact is one of the things that I think it's referring to. I don't know, because I mean, I assume it is because the thing is, like, one of the things that is happening right now is that they have these huge power stations in the US that are causing health issues for their own citizens. And what is worrying is that as environmental groups push back against it, which they have in different states, which, absolutely need to happen. What
Mm.
I do worry is that they will just outsource these power plants to other countries that don't have as robust climate activists, say, or climate movements, because they're incredibly impoverished, etc. So that is one of my concerns
Yeah.
with that. I think that's actually kind of predictable what they will be doing if they haven't already. But then, in what other areas would they be Is it like
Yeah.
the other part I can see is maybe surveillance and security and privacy, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think, I don't know from this document if it's really clear exactly what they mean. I think they just want to deregulate everything, right? And so
Right.
as AI is just becomes this kind of thing which you can use to wedge open that door. But I guess the key things would be, as you said, around like deregulation of like planning in terms of like new fossil fuel based power stations to fuel data centers, planning to actually build these data centers themselves. So, making it easier to make enormous sort of hyperscale data centers, which, have bad impacts on local economies and local climates, like using up all the water and employing 10 people, but so they're not very labor intensive, so they don't actually create that many jobs. Maybe they create some jobs when they're being built, but then it can be run by a handful of people really. So not being good for the local economy. But then also, I suppose that's on one side. That's the hardware side of things, or the infrastructure side of things. Then I guess the other thing is around, yeah, as you said, like the use of data, what data is allowed to be used to train these kind of models. The questions around AI safety, where there have been any regulation in that, which is probably quite light touch at the moment. Although, yeah, I mean, there's another thing is the extent to which we need AI safety, or whether we should be thinking about it in different terms. But yeah, so I guess getting rid of any kind of regulation around these kind of the safety systems built into AI, making them. I mean, there's also a lot in this document about censorship and quote unquote AI models needing to promote free speech, and this kind of thing. So I guess like removing what they see as barriers for these things as well.
It's such a weird one too, because I know that the US promotes themselves as a free speech, like nation, country, whatever, but they don't actually have free speech. And they're definitely extremely controlling when it comes to US empire narratives. So I think it's going to be a veneer of free speech while they heavily control the information that's coming out. But how do you do that on an AI model? I mean, this is where we need to get into AI more.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that's a really good question, and I would say you can't. I mean, my view is that the text which gets extruded from these models, that's based on probabilities and having thrown lots of training data at it. So at this text, I don't consider it to be speech and to be capable of having free speech, because it's not an utterance from like any intelligent being. It doesn't. I think thinking about it even in those terms is just a really ridiculous way to look at it. Yeah. So it's kind of a funny use of the term free speech for which something which is just not capable of, we shouldn't be thinking about it in that kind of term, in those terms whatsoever. So yeah, the reason that free speech is in this document is because it's another ideological talking point of the administration, right? It's got nothing to do with the realities of what's important in the field, in the sector. I mean, they could have probably replaced the word AI with anything like industry or technology or something, and then it could be almost the exact same document. It's like,
Right. Yeah, you're right. They would actually use the same talking points regardless of whatever they're pitching.
yeah,
Basically.
yeah, yeah. I
That's
think so.
basically, but right now AI is just considered it is the thing that is like propping up the economy. I think you did sort of allude to that already. Like one of the reasons
Mm.
why it is so misunderstood is that it is AI is considered to be the thing that is
Mm-hmm.
the driving force of the economy right now, and the investment in AI because, partly because of action plans like this, the US really believing that they need to have global dominance in terms of AI So the investment, it's like a chicken and egg situation where because they believe that they sort of inflate the effects of AI to get more investment and it's like a vicious circle. So, I mean, one of the examples is that Sam Altman is still pursuing right now. I think he's accrued something like 50 to 100 million or billion? Okay, don't quote me on that. A million or billion, but like because the actual fund that he's suggesting for a new AI infrastructure initiative is $7 trillion
Yeah, this
dollars.
is the number I keep seeing as well. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
and it's
I
like
feel
a
it's just a
tiny.
number they were just thinking, what's a really big number that will shock everybody, and then they say 7 trillion. It's just ridiculous. I mean,
I think it's like it's such an interesting thing because $7 trillion is
sounds
insane.
funny just saying it. I just
Yeah, it is.
makes me laugh. Yeah.
It's so crazy. If we think about the
Mm.
entire annual military budget being $1.5 trillion dollars,
Yeah.
$7 trillion
Yeah. Yeah.
dollars. But I think it's also a way for him to inflate stocks. It's another thing to be like, this is what you should invest in.
I really do believe that that's the only reason to throw out these ridiculous numbers is, I mean, that's his entire sort of reason for being in a corporate sense, isn't it? It's just he's doing anything he can to pump up the value of this company by pumping up the value of AI and how much it will cost and so forth. And, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they are, we also have to remember that OpenAI was also, was it co-founded or like Elon Musk was also part of that. And then Peter Thiel is, I think,
Yeah.
Sam Altman's mentor, or I mean, so this
Yeah.
is like this small billion-dollar club.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's very much like this kind of yeah, these sort of establishment Silicon Valley figures, yeah, who very much have this motivation of making the company seem worth much more than it is, because that's the way that these things work. Yeah, yeah. And it's incredibly dangerous, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen when, if or when, or whatever. We can't tell the future, but it seems from my perspective that it is a bubble and that eventually it will burst in some way, and then the impact that has on the wider like global economy and so forth is really potentially very dangerous. Yeah, so it's scary. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I don't really know how long they're going to be able to sustain this type of bubble. I mean, the headlines are already coming out that it's a bubble. And so I
Yeah,
guess
you,
we'll
you
see
you
what
you see them
happens.
more and more, and it's if we knew what was going to happen, we could probably make lots of money on the stock market. So there's so
The
many
problem is
factors
they
are in
know.
it. Yeah,
They
yeah,
probably know and they're making
yeah.
money, but yeah,
Well,
I'm too scared to try anything like this.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I suppose it's a question of how long the investor is like either private or the state, how long they're willing to continue to fund it, while it doesn't make any money essentially, or it makes lots of revenue, but it's costing lots more than it's making and so forth. So yeah,
Yeah, I think, okay, so before we get into the AI myths, I think we do actually have to go into what AI actually is. And I guess this kind of fits into the myth, what it isn't, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about what AI is. So can you sort of give us the basic understanding of what is AI?
the first thing to say is like, so I'm coming at this from a humanities perspective. I hope that there's some value in that, because I think we think about different kinds of questions. And one thing that people who come from humanities background are interested in are words, and so like looking at just the term itself, like artificial intelligence, is I think a good place to start. And in a way, it's like it doesn't really say anything, right? So it's kind of like a meaningless term. It's what is artificial intelligence? It could be anything or it could be everything. And so I think that's like a good thing to bear in mind in the first place, is that this term itself is being used in a kind of an aspirational way. And it's become almost like a marketing term, because it's like, oh, it's artificial intelligence, so it must be intelligent. And there's nothing, it doesn't describe anything about what is actually behind these technologies. And it's not a new term. So the artificial intelligence is more or less sort of thought of as being, well, not discovered, but thought of in the modern sense first by Alan Turing, which he worked on this from the 1940s and 1950s. So it's obviously like a really broad term. and in some ways kind of meaningless, but it's, we could say it's
But can we just
anything.
clarify this like
Yeah,
Turing thing?
yeah.
Because I've heard about the Turing test. If you could describe to us what that test is, but is that how you determine artificial intelligence? Or what is that test? Because can
Well,
you
yeah,
describe it to us?
so it's a good question as well. And so my understanding is that so Turing was very much, you can read his original papers in AI, and they're actually really good reads. Like he's an amazing writer. He's quite funny, and he explains things really well. But he was a mathematician, but he was also very much coming at it from this kind of philosophical point of view. And I don't think that he really meant the Turing test to be an actual thing that people did to determine AI. So it was much more, he was interested in like thought experiments and the philosophical way of doing things. So he sort of invented in his head this kind of perfect computer, which is called a Turing machine. But he never meant for this to actually be something which existed in the real world. So the idea of the Turing test, and again, Turing was not thinking about doing this practically at all. Like this is purely like a exercise in like logic and reasoning and philosophical way of thinking about artificial intelligence. So anyway, the Turing test is this idea that you have a person talk to a computer, so that the person isn't aware of whether the person that they're talking to is a computer or another human. And if the human is not able to, or guesses incorrectly that this is a computer, then that would mean that this computer passed the Turing test and could be said to be giving the impression of intelligence. So that's also important, right? So I don't think he was ever talking about something being actually intelligent, but giving, if you fool a person into thinking that you're possibly another person, then that's enough to give the impression of intelligence.
Yeah, that's too low a bar at the moment, I think, is
Yeah,
a problem.
yeah. Well, it was never meant, I think, as a serious way to
Right.
determine like intelligence for a computer. And yeah, I think that there's lots of papers saying that computers have passed the Turing test. If you really thought about it, right? If you really talked with even the best chatbot out there, you could eventually, maybe it would take you a while, maybe it would take you a year or 10 years or something, but I think always eventually you would, yeah. Again, like thinking about it like a thought experiment in the way that Turing does. Like we're not, it's not,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
problem. It's like too imprecise a test, and also
yeah,
depends on who the person is, because I feel
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
you can have a person that would believe it would, do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
so it really depends on, it's just, I don't think it's scientific enough. Okay, as a non-scientist,
yeah.
I'm like, and he didn't mean it that way, I don't think.
I think, yeah, if you kind of think of it as like a real test, yeah, for sure,
Then, yeah.
because we might be fooled for a while, right? I mean, I think you could talk to something for, yeah, as they say, half an hour, and then you're not going to guess. But if you really wanted to find
An
out,
hour is a
and you had,
long time, by the way, to
yeah,
talk to a chat box and not
no, I wouldn't
realize
recommend doing that.
that,
Yeah,
that's, I feel that's bad. And I think the other thing that maybe is unaccounted for in this, like, as you are humanities professor, like, is just the way in which human beings can associate, like, they personify objects. So
mm-hmm.
so you can start to believe that it's sentient if
Mm-hmm.
the more you
Mm-hmm.
talk to something,
Yeah,
like, even
yeah,
if
yeah,
it's not.
yeah.
So
And it doesn't even need to be that intelligent in that case. So another example is something called the ELISA effect, which was an experiment done, I think, in maybe the 60s, where a researcher programmed an incredibly simple chatbot. It asks you how you are, and then you write back something, and then it will take that and it just kind of spits it back at you. So if you say, "Oh, I'm feeling sad today," it will say, "Why are you feeling sad?" And then you say something else, and it will say, "Oh, well, why is that the case?" Or, just
right.
really, really no intelligence at all. Just a set of really simple rules which make give the impression of having a conversation. And what the researcher found was that people started to have these like really intimate, detailed, like psychological conversations with this chatbot, with this program, because they kind of imbued it with. I think we have this real innate kind of instinct to give human qualities to anything. It's like we're very willing to look over lots of things and think that something is human.
And I think this does speak to our current culture right now, because there's this feeling that people are not seen, they're not heard. and they just want to be seen and they just want to be heard. And that's just very sad. Like, it's
Yeah,
very sad that what you're saying is just, it's basically, I think a lot of talk therapy is based on that sort of model of just like listening and repeating.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, and it works. Yeah, yeah, which is the interesting thing. It's a strange phenomenon, isn't it? That we can, yeah, we often what we need is just our own words projected back at us.
I think it's quite terrible, actually, but before we digress too
Yeah,
far
yeah,
from that,
we've
because
got off the AI,
we've kind of gone off. I mean,
off
that does
the
sort
AI
of
train.
relate to some of the fears about AI, but I
Yeah,
think, again, just to get back to what is
yeah,
AI, do you
yeah,
think? Like, because it's not, I think it's hard to actually explain what AI is without explaining what people think it is.
yeah,
I guess that's the
yeah,
thing. It's like
yeah.
people really do think it is an intelligence that sort
Mm,
of comes out. I think the idea is that it is more intelligent than humankind. Like, I
mm.
think is that's kind of the idea, right? That people have about AI.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, maybe of this particular sort of supposed development of AI called artificial general intelligence, right? This AGI, which is, yeah, this kind of sci-fi idea that, eventually it will be smarter than us, and then it will be able to even it will get to a point where it's so smart that it can program itself and make itself smarter, and then there's this kind of snowball effect and so forth. So, like, very much this kind of science fiction thing, and something which we're definitely not seeing in reality at all. But so I'll try and go through the history of AI really quickly. Like, so hopefully this kind of also helps to give an understanding of what it is that people mean when they say AI today. So after Turing, you have this kind of approach to artificial or machine intelligence, which is like rules based. So a little bit like this Eliza chatbot, but more sophisticated. And so there was this, for a long time, there was this thought that you could sort of program like a set of rules to govern like a computer's mind, and you could sort of account for every single individual scenario, like if this happens do this, and then if this happens do this, and if you could do this enough, that the machine would have so many rules and procedures for every single situation that it would actually display some kind of intelligence. It would just follow like its rule from once, down a particular path. And that's called symbolic AI. So it's like using kind of symbols in a way, like, if this, then that, and is one way of thinking about it. So everything has a rule, not just for like machines, and not just to make things sort of human like, but also to recognize an image or to recognize a handwritten digit on a page. You could write a series of rules, like if you see a downward slash and then a slash across, then it must be a T, whatever it is. And so that was, for a long time, like, that was the way that people thought AI, or machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, was going to go. There was also at the same time another branch which was interested in something called neural networks. People always say, like, oh, it's trying to model intelligence in the same way that the human brain works. And I'm not really convinced that they're that similar to the way that neurons in the brain works, but that's the language they used anyway. And so this approach is much more like, you just give it lots of examples of something. Like, so instead of trying to program like rules to say, oh, this is the letter T, you just say, here's like 100,000 examples of the letter T, you figure it out. And then so these neural networks are kind of able to do some little adjustments in the maths that they're doing, and they're able to get quite good at figuring things out from lots of examples. And so that was kind of seen as like not very important for a long time. And then maybe like 15 years ago or so, some researchers started to realize that this neural network approach actually worked incredibly well if you were able to like throw loads of data at it. So if you're able to give it loads of examples of, like, an image of a cat or something, it's able to get really good at detecting new images of cats, and whatever that is. And so then this became like by far the like dominant paradigm, this neural network approach. So no more, we're not thinking about explicit rules anymore, but we're thinking about how we can sort of use lots of examples to train it, and then it can kind of get better at doing a thing from that. And so that brings us up to, we're almost at the beginnings of like this modern AI, which becomes like chatbots and chat GPT and so forth, right? So in 2017, as well as trying to recognize images. It was also, they also realized that it was quite good at kind of understanding and predicting text. Like, so you could give it lots of documents and say, right, this document is about sports and this document is about foreign affairs. And if you give it enough examples and you give it all the text, it was able to figure out and sort of sort into the different categories. And the big breakthrough was a paper written in 2017, which introduced a kind of a special type of neural network or approach to it, which was called a transformer. And the main thing to know here is that this transformer algorithm is able to sort of understand a little bit more about how text in a sentence works. So it's able to sort of point towards the important bits of a sentence. It's sort of understanding how language and how words work in a sequence, which it hadn't really done before. So this is a transformer, right? And so the transformer is the T in ChatGPT. So it's a general pre-trained transformer, I think, is the full thing. So this is like a really important technology, basically, that underpins everything that we do with text in particular. And almost there, I promise. But so the next thing is that, as well as being able to do this kind of classification, right? So, you know, sports or news and so forth, somebody realized that actually you can just give it a load of text and then you can delete the next word in any of a sequence of text. And then you can ask it to predict what it thought that next word was going to be, right? So, I don't know, what's an example? Like the sky, if you gave it the sequence, the sky is, because you've given it so much kind of real world text and it has so many examples of like the sky is blue in this real world text, it's able to get really good at predicting what the next word in a sequence should be. That literally is all it's doing. So all of this ChatGPT AI, everything that we're talking about, that is all that's happening, is that it's just predicting the next word in a sequence. It's more than it sounds in a way, because we can do a lot of things with just predicting the next text in a sequence, because the sequence can be very long. It can be like, you know, lots of code, or it can be lots of detailed instructions or whatever it is. And then the output of that can be kind of quite complicated and in some cases be useful and usable for lots of different things. But basically that's all we're talking about when we talk about AI is this kind of text prediction. So they realized that this was, you know, this is possible to do this and to kind of get some understanding of like language through training these things to predict what's going to come next in the text. It has like what's called a model. And that's like a fingerprint for all the text in its system. And it's able to use these fingerprints to kind of understand like, well, this fingerprint is similar to this fingerprint, so I should give this word and so forth. And so that's what ChatGPT is doing, basically. And then so one last kind of step. So you have these kind of models, right, which have this kind of, fingerprints of all of the language in its memory. What they've been doing the last year or two is they've been doing additional steps where they take this model, which has been trained on, you know, the whole internet basically, and then they just add in this very detailed, structured information to it. So they give it like supposedly like 600,000 coding and math and logic problems, and then they say, okay, well, get really good at figuring all these out. And then when that's done, the new version, the new text prediction machine is actually really good at doing what seems like intelligence, because it's like able to solve all of these logic and math and code problems because it's kind of seen them before or seen similar versions and so forth. Yeah, so that's kind of the technology behind it, I suppose, is these neural networks.
But so basically, from my understanding from what you're saying, is basically the AI that we have now is, well, we can train it by giving it certain amounts of different types of data, and it's basically pattern recognition that allows it to predict the answer for things. And so like depending on what like type of content you put into the AI is what you're gonna sort of get back.
Absolutely, that's all it is. It's just, I mean, even the procedures for doing this are getting very simple. You know, you can do it yourself. But the key and the expensive part, well, is first of all, obviously the computer power is very expensive. So there's a reason they're building all of these centers. But also the examples that you give it and they entirely determine what you're going to get out of it entirely. So first of all, the data that these companies are using to train these is they don't tell us what they're using for lots of reasons. One reason is because it's more than likely they're using a huge amount of illegally pirated material, like even all of the, these established companies, because there's no other way of easily getting hold of it. But also they're also creating these very expensive data sets. They're hiring people across the world. They're outsourcing it. I don't know the exact details of the supply chain, but they're getting people to write these complicated training examples, which kind of refine the model to make it usable. So if you just ingest the whole internet and then you put that out as a chatbot, then it's like nonsense. It's like, it's not going to be very useful. So you have to do all of these additional steps to kind of tweak it into something which you can chat to and will give you sort of logical examples back.
Right. So to go back to this thing that we talked about earlier, which is like this idea that the American AI action plan could be like promoting free speech, really doesn't make sense in this context, because it's like, one, if you were to just scrape the internet, which I was just thinking, oh, that's what AI does. It just scrapes the internet.
Yeah.
But it scrapes the internet, but because of its training protocols, that sort of determines how it categorizes things, right? And how it predicts patterns and sees patterns. So the training component of all these AI things are going to have guidelines. You can't really have anything that's like just free speech, because they're going to have guidelines in it.
No, it's a ridiculous idea. I think you've summed it up really well. Like, it just doesn't make sense in any context to think of free speech and AI, because it's not,
it doesn't have a real point of view separate from training.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's nothing sort of open about the training data in itself that makes it, even if it ingested every possible word it could find of text on the internet, that doesn't mean that it will be any better at promoting free speech than any other model. To me, it just seems like a red herring, or just like a nonsense thing to say about AI, because
it will still need to find patterns, even if there was no guidelines.
Yeah.
It would just be looking for like the majority, right? Like if there were no guidelines at all,
Yeah.
it would still have to present information in some way. Like, so it could be completely random if there were no guidelines, or like the majority of what people are saying could end up be the answer.
Yeah.
To any question.
Yeah. Or, well, and just to be clear, not even the majority of what people are saying, but the majority of what all of the text on the internet says, all of the available text on the internet says. So it's not like it's not like a good poll of like what people are thinking, because we don't know where that's come from or what biases it has. Like, it's obviously incredibly Anglocentric, dominated by global north, and it's going to give some kind of text, but we don't know the extent to which it's, we don't know what its biases are, and how they're impacting it and so forth.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. So the China Global AI Governance Action Plan emphasizes open source and open application scenarios. This obviously goes against the US need for global dominance, because the whole thing of the global dominance with the US is that they're going to need to have a monopoly. Otherwise, you can't have global dominance without having the monopoly. In their action plan, they have the second pillar, which is called Accelerate AI Innovation. And they do have this section called Encourage Open Source and Open Weight AI. So two things here. Could you sort of even explain what that is? What's the difference between that? And like, can you explain to me why? Like, to me, that's very contradictory from what their express purpose is.
Yeah.
But yeah, so can you like talk me through that? And then I have that follow-up question about NVIDIA.
Yeah. Well, so open weight and open source are kind of two of these terms which there's a little bit of ambiguity even around, what these mean in terms of like the technology. But basically, open source is a term which has been around for a very long time, and it's generally taken to mean software where the code is entirely available for anyone to use, and also anyone is allowed to remix and reuse. So it has like a very kind of permissive license alongside it. And it's also you can view the source code very easily. It's like published, you know. And so that's what open source is like traditionally thought of as. And so we can get on in a second maybe to, you know, the extent to which how that applies in terms of these models. So open weight then is, so I was talking earlier about these language models, right? So, you know, these things which have been made by the neural networks and so forth, as having like a sort of fingerprint for all of the language which they've been trained on, right? So every kind of word in a way has like a unique fingerprint, or a fingerprint can be generated based on its, you know, where it occurs in a sentence and the context around it and so forth. These fingerprints are literally just like series of numbers essentially. And so to publish an open weight model just means that you make these fingerprints available for anyone to use, and you don't publish any of the process by which you got to those fingerprints. And it does have some value, right? So if you have the fingerprints, you can relatively cheaply, well, actually incredibly easily, you can give it new examples of something, and you can make small changes to these fingerprints, which make it useful to you for a particular task. So it does have some value, and they usually do like allow people to reuse them in lots of different cases. So there's quite a few companies which have made open weight models. So Facebook, Meta, they publish all their models open weight and have done, I think, since the beginning. I think part of that is a strategy that they kind of know that they're not the leaders in the market. And so the way to catch up, or the way to play along, is to be the open source ones, so which everyone can use. You know, a little bit like when Google was trying to compete with Apple with cell phones, with smartphones. Their plan was to make an open source operating system that everyone could use. So I guess it's the same kind of strategy maybe as that.
Wait, was that open weight or open source?
That's open weight. Open weight.
Oh,
Yeah.
so, but they made their models open source or open
Just
weight?
open weight.
Oh,
Just,
okay, sorry.
yeah.
I think you said open source, so I got
Sorry.
confused.
Okay.
Open weight. So in terms of Facebook and Meta,
Yeah.
they made it open weight.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then, so that allows people to develop apps based on.
Yeah. Well, so it allows you to take their set of fingerprints, right? So their sort of representation, this thing that they've made, which can be used for predicting text or classifying text and so forth. And they allow you to take that and adjust it and use it yourself as well. So yeah, if you want to, you can build an application using their models. You can do that. And the reason that people don't is because I think it costs probably more to run it than it's worth, you know, that you can get out of customers. There are AI apps, and they will either be using an open weight model, which they've trained to do something specific for themselves from someone like Meta, or they're just directly calling the open AI like ChatGPT or some other service and talking to that service and paying a little bit of money.
Even though they're called
Yeah.
open, they charge. There's like a.
Well, so the open weight models anyone generally can just download and use, but they cost you money because you need to then put it onto a computer somewhere, and every time you use it or change it, that costs a little bit of resources of like computing time. And just because you have their fingerprints, to use those fingerprints, you need to expend your own computing power. You need to have a computer do something every time, and that adds up to lots of, that can be very expensive depending on what you're doing. So they're releasing like the underlying thing, but then to use that thing, it costs a lot of resources.
What about DeepSeek?
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting case. So they say it's open source, and to a certain extent it is. So they have more or less released the code by which they train the model. And they did some interesting things about they sort of skipped one of the steps which you usually do, and that made it much cheaper. And that's why they kind of say like it's a cheaper model. They went straight onto a kind of a final step, and that seems to work quite well in some cases. And so they released all of that code. So you can, if you want to, you can basically recreate their training process by which they made this model. But there is one kind of key thing to know is that they didn't, and none of these companies release the data on which they train it. So that doesn't happen. So you can't fully recreate a copy of their exact thing because they don't release the data. You can train it on your own data, but you're going to get something slightly different. And so there doesn't seem to be any company which is really doing that at the moment for various reasons. But it is more open than Meta, and certainly more open than the closed ones like OpenAI and so forth, generally.
But in terms of something like NVIDIA, which, like we said, is a monopoly and wants to maintain its monopoly, that's hence the sanctions against China, the sanctions against semiconductor. But basically, CUDA CUDA is closed sourced, and it is the thing that gives NVIDIA the edge and the monopoly. Can you talk through what that is and why it's significant?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. And so when it gets into the real weeds of the hardware and this side of things, it gets very complex. So I'll try my best, and apologies if anything is incorrect. But basically, NVIDIA, I don't know if you were a gamer, but they used to be, if you bought a graphics card for gaming in like the 90s or 2000s, it was probably NVIDIA. And that was what the whole purpose of the company was, to make these graphic processing units, GPUs, which are used mostly in gaming, but also then in, for video editing and things. But then at some point they realized that you could use it for these AI training tasks, for training these language models. And it's incredibly good. It's because of the architecture of these cards, they're able to sort of do a particular type of math which you need to train these models, and they're able to do it really quickly. But they need an extra layer to basically allow them to do these new tasks. And this is, and NVIDIA developed this software. I read somewhere that they've spent like $1 billion developing it. They put a load of resources when they realized this was going to be a thing into developing this software called CUDA, which is like a very, very complicated set of instructions on how these graphics cards should do these tasks, do these training tasks. And they have made it proprietary. Yeah, so I think in a very similar way to Microsoft Windows being proprietary, you can only use an NVIDIA card with CUDA, and you can only use CUDA with an NVIDIA card. I believe it works in both ways. Yeah. And because it's proprietary, it's also not really interchangeable. So you couldn't just decide to use some other software or decide to just plug another card into the CUDA software or whatever it is. And so because they're so dominant, it helps to maintain that dominance, right? Because there isn't another player which is big enough that people are willing to switch over, just like with the reason why everyone uses Microsoft Windows. It's just become so dominant and integrated, insinuated into our daily life, whether we like it or not. And so it's in the same way as people training these language models, they're kind of forced to use this. And so I think a lot of the conversation at the moment is whether another company like Huawei can catch up. Can they make their own sort of software stack which uses their cards, and whether they can convince enough people to switch over to these things in order to gain a foothold in this market. So it's interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of incredibly complex supply chains, I gather, with these things. So almost all of these chips, whether they're Huawei or NVIDIA and so forth, they're all made by one company in Taiwan, TSMC, I believe. They're so far ahead in every other company in their processes that they're the only ones who are able to do this for you, basically. Otherwise, it's impossible. And then in turn, that company needs a photolithography machine. So this machine that makes the machines, makes the chips. And that's the only company in the world that can make those good enough. Is a Dutch company called ASML. This company has lots of pressure put on it by the Trump administration and by the EU to not sell to China, because then they can make their own and so forth. So they have all these export bans. Yeah, it's complicated.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.